So our next guest on the podcast today is Wes Huff, who is a fellow apologist like myself. We've actually had him on the podcast before, and he's going to share his miracle story with us. Thank you, Wes, for coming on again.
Pleasure to be here.
So do you want to share a little bit about your story from your childhood with us?
Yeah, so after or just before I should say my 12th birthday, I was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition that left me paralyzed from the waist down. And I actually have a section of my mom's journal from that time. And at the top it says January 8th, which was the day that this took place. And I had actually been home from school. It was a Wednesday, and I had had the flu. So I was staying home from school, and I was, as my mom says, she describes me being very sick and says that she'd camp me out on the bathroom floor close to the sink and the toilet for reasons we don't have to go into. And she says, Wes falls asleep, but when he wakes, he calls me and says, Mom, I can't feel my legs. I ask him if he is sure and then scratch his lower leg up to the mid-thigh. He shakes his hand, indicating there's no feeling. She then goes on to say that she called a friend of hers whose kids had also had this flu to see if this was, a symptom that made sense. And when her friend told her that it wasn't, she was advised to call 911. And so she eventually called telehealth, which encouraged her to call an ambulance. And I was rushed to the local hospital there. At the time, we were living in a small town in central Ontario. And the local hospital there, basically, they concluded that they didn't have the expertise to figure out what was going on. And so I was rushed in ambulance to a hospital in London, Ontario. So all of this, the journal entry starts at 4:30 p.m. that night. And by 6:30, I was in London. By 8, I had had a number of tests done to me, an MRI, blood taken. They'd done a lumbar puncture, which is a spinal tap. And by 11:55 in the journal, it says, Wes returns, results are positive, no cysts, no tumors on the spinal cord, no swelling, diagnosis, body might be attacking itself. And basically what they told me what was happening was that my body's immune system, instead of attacking the flu that I had, it attacked the nerve endings at the base of my spinal cord, causing inflammation and leaving me a paraplegic. And so I was paralyzed from the waist down. And the condition, which I think I mentioned before, if I didn't, is called acute transverse myelitis, which is a word that you can forget as soon as you hear it. But if you look it up online, it says in the prognosis section that generally the more rapid the progression is, the worse the prognosis is. And as far as I knew, mine was instant. I'd literally woken up and was paralyzed from going down for a nap, not being paralyzed. And so based on that, the diagnosis was that I would probably be a paraplegic for the rest of my life. There was some hope that through physical therapy and years of stuff like that I might be able to walk. They said I would never be able to run, but that I was most likely going to be a paraplegic. And the short story is that happened on January 8th of that year. On February 8th, 1 month exactly to the day, I woke up on a Saturday morning, got out of bed, walked over to my wheelchair and sat down. And that was it. And as quickly as it happened, it seemed to go away. And there were no side effects. There was no muscle atrophy from not being my legs not being used for those 4 weeks.
Did it take you a second to realize after you got up from your nap and walked to your wheelchair, right? Like you walked to the wheelchair, right? And so did it take you a second to realize, like, hold on a second, I'm okay?
Yeah, I definitely knew that something was different from the previous days or weeks that I had, done the same sort of routine every day, fallen out of my bed, crawled over to my wheelchair. And that day I had walked over to my wheelchair. And so I remember staring at the wall, figuring out what might have been different. And actually, now that I think about it, I looked down at my toe and I wiggled it, and that was kind of the catalyst. That I then got out of bed and I ran upstairs, got my parents, and they made me run up and down the stairs a few times after that while my mom cried.
And so through all this, I remember you telling me before that your school wasn't wheelchair accessible at that point because this was like before that was a mandated thing in Ontario. And so they had to build all those things for you because you were their first wheelchair student.
Yeah, there was another student in my class who had a physical disability and he had a walker, but the school wasn't really outfitted. This was the early 2000s, and it wasn't sort of mandated like it is today that there be wheelchair accessibility across the board. And so there were a number of things that they had to do to the school, like we also had to do to my house. The house that we were living in was an older, I believe it was over 100 years old, Victorian house. It was the parsonage of the church. My dad was a pastor, and we had to put a ramp on our house, and that was new too, right? And when my mom actually told the principal that I was healed, that I was no longer paralyzed, he cried. And I don't think it was because he was so overjoyed that I was no longer paralyzed. I think it had more to do with the fact that I'd caused him so much stress and anxiety over all the things he had to do to his school.
You had obviously numerous doctors looking after you and doing tests and giving you the prognosis and everything. How did they respond to this dramatic recovery?
Yeah, I had 3 specialists who were in charge of me at the hospital in London, and I think there were more doctors than that who were overlooking my case, but there were 3 doctors in particular. We have a number of photographs from that time, and there are these 3 individuals, and I had a scheduled appointment. I believe it was a scheduled appointment already on the books a short time after that date of February 8th. And so I went to that appointment and walked into the hospital. And it was the doctors who first used the word miracle, really before I remember anybody else using it, because they said, we have no medical explanation for what's happened. You shouldn't be like this. You shouldn't be able to walk like you're walking. And so
the doctors were the ones that actually said, this is not something that should happen. This is a miracle.
Yeah, my mom, well, one of the doctors asked my mom what we had done. And so she had said, we prayed. And the story that my mom tells is that he eventually printed off a list of all the other kids in the intensive care unit and gave it to her and said, can you pray for these? Maybe jokingly, maybe not jokingly, but either way, I think, there was a sense of something has gone awry here, that this shouldn't be the way that it is, especially considering the severity of my case and the slow progression.
So that's amazing that, like, you should have been wheelchair bound the rest of your life, not able to run. And now, like, people can probably tell you're a fairly athletic guy. You're able to do all that now. And literally the doctors even being willing to say, there's no medical reason, there's no naturalistic explanation for this. We consider this miraculous. So that works as a pretty good example of God answering prayer.
Yeah, and there was, I felt at that point in time, that was elementary school. But later on, as I went into high school, the conviction that God had shown me something as simple as being able to walk in and out of a room, that I was taking advantage of that. And so I invested a lot of my time and effort later in my teens to athletics. I ran track and field through high school, went on to run varsity track in my university undergrad years. And a big motivation of that was that I felt that I could glorify God in this simple way of not taking advantage of something that He had allowed me to be privy to, of how much we take for granted something as simple as walking and running.
Yeah. And then running track and field, that's glorifying to God, saying, thank you, God, for giving me my legs back. So that's awesome.